I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program coming to you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We're doing a series of programs on the Holocaust of the Germans. Germany must perish was the cry and the plan in the early 40s and in the late 40s. There was the Theodor N. Kaufmann plan published in this book, the only plan of genocide to come out of the Second World War by a Jewish writer against the German nation, advocating the total annihilation through sterilization of the German people, some 70 million people. Nothing that Hitler could ever have been proven and was ever proven to have said was anywhere near as monstrous as this Jewish writer's plan for the extermination of the German people. There's the Morgenthau Plan, adopted as official government policy by the United States, promulgated by the Secretary of the Treasury, another Jew. The Allies had a genocidal plan for the Germans. You can read that in an American book published already in 1947. It's available in good libraries and as reprints. Gruesome Harvest is the title. The subtitle is The Costly Attempt to Exterminate the German People. And it was written by Ralph Franklin Keeling, and it was published first in 1947 by the Institute of American Economics. It has on the very first page a kind of a quote from Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, given July 31st, 1939 to the House of Commons. And he said, "If war should come, whichever side may claim ultimate victory, nothing is more certain than that victor and vanquished alike would glean a gruesome harvest of human misery and suffering." Having been a child during that Holocaust of the Germans in Germany, I can tell you that this was prophetic what Neville Chamberlain said, for which he was of course vilified throughout the English-speaking world as an appeaser. The book Gruesome Harvest, Chapter 1, talks about the war of devastation that the Allies unleashed against the Germans. Devastation of the Reich by total warfare was alone enough to cast serious doubt on Germany's post-war ability to survive. Never before in history had the life-sustaining resources of a nation been so thoroughly demolished. Returning from victory in Europe, General Bradley declared, quote, "I can tell you that Germany has been destroyed utterly and completely." End of quote. The demand for unconditional surrender had forced the desperate Germans to fight to the bitter end, until their cities had been pulverized into death-ridden rubble and their factories, railroads, canals, dams, power installations, communications, buildings, homes, all their exposed facilities had been converted into heaps of twisted, smoldering ruins. Allied fervor to destroy everything German had been expressed by General Eisenhower with the opening of the Ruhr Drive. Quote, "Our primary purpose," quote, he declared, quote, "is destruction of as many Germans as possible. I expect to destroy every German west of the Rhine and within that area in which we are attacking." End of quote. Now note that Eisenhower isn't talking about Nazis. He isn't talking about plants or factories. He is talking about our primary purpose is the destruction of as many Germans as possible. Ask some of the GIs who were involved in that campaign. Ask them how many prisoners they shot. Ask them how many were killed at Hürtgen Forest after they had already surrendered, or in the Eifel. Many of the GIs that now are old and don't have very long to live want to unburden their soul. Many of them have confessed to me that many a German soldier was shot at point-blank range because Eisenhower said, "Our primary purpose is the destruction of as many Germans as possible. I expect to destroy every German west of the Rhine and within that area in which we are attacking." The author of Gruesome Harvest goes on to say, Allied capacity to destroy became overwhelming after the American industrial colossus had been converted from peacetime to war production. American output soon surpassed that of all other belligerents in the war combined and became twice as great as the capacity of the doomed Axis. Get that, huh? Twice as great was the productive capacity of the United States alone. That's not counting England, Australia, South Africa, Russia. America alone produced twice as much war material as the Axis did. Stunned by American power, Hermann Göring confessed to his Nuremberg prison guards, "The industrial genius of America is something of which no one dreamt." A glimpse of America's smashing force when devoted to the grim business of mass production of death and destruction is provided by the following description, written by a frontline war correspondent. Quote, "A cataclysmic blast of exploding, splintering steel rent the earth before us, and it seemed like the world was coming to an end. The Americans were blasting out a path for a forward drive. Man and beast shuddered in their tracks. Whole towns were disintegrating. Life seemed to disappear from the scene. It was the most terrifying, destructive force of warfare Germany has ever seen. And it was a symbol of what was to come out as the U.S. First Army unloosed this shattering blow within the borders of Germany. For an hour and a half, more than 2,000 bombers and hundreds of guns pounded the German countryside, making the earth dance before this mighty man-made force. When the heavies and mediums were not making the earth quake for miles around, our massed artillery was giving them hell out there. They were firing at an average rate of 1 round every 15 seconds, blasting every conceivable obstacle in our path. Minefields went up as though touched off by an electric switch. In the center of that frightful scene, the Germans were entrenched as a human wall. They were dug in foxholes and inside houses of fortified towns. Many died without knowing what had hit them. Having seen brave men and wild beasts crack as they do sometimes in the grip of a terrible earthquake, I could have sworn there would be no opposition when 0 hour came. Yet, when our tanks and doughboys went over the top after the barrage, as in the Battle of Verdun, there were Germans still alive, and they fought us with violence. This is an American war correspondent giving a description of what it was like. Now, my sister has a little restaurant in Germany. One day when I came from Canada to go home, visit my sister, there was a man sitting at the dinner table having his lunch, and I remember his fork and his knife was making this kind of a sound like that constantly. And so I finally looked at my sister and I said, "What is the problem with that man?" And she said, "Well, he was one of General Ramke's paratroopers who was in the path of one of those American assaults in France. And ever since that time in 1944, that man's hands have never stopped trembling." So when this American says that having seen brave men and wild beasts crack as they do sometimes in the grip of a terrible earthquake, I could have sworn there would be no opposition when 0 hour came. Yet when our tanks and doughboys went over the top, the barrage as in the Battle of Verdun, there were Germans still alive, and they fought us with violence and with courage, he could have added. Because that was heroism. As a kid, I was nearby when bombs fell. Nothing anywhere near 2,000 bombers, but I can tell you, there is nothing that makes you as helpless and make you feel as powerless than when these monstrous planes come and unload their death and destruction. And yet, these German men got up and they fought. Why? Because this book, read by members of Dr. Goebbels' propaganda ministry over the German airwaves, this book, written by a Jew in the United States in 1941, sold by the millions for 25 cents hardcover, a piece at the time, called by the Time magazine book reviewer a sensational idea, and called by the Washington Post a provocative theory interestingly represented, and the New York Times a plan for permanent peace among civilized nations, advocated the death by sterilization of all Germans, starting with the army units first. That's why these Germans fought after these attacks. But back to the book Gruesome Harvest. Great though it was, the destruction resulting from ground fighting pales in comparison with that caused by our gigantic air raids. The 2 atom bombs dropped on Japan may have been more dramatic, but they could hardly have been more destructive than the millions of phosphorus, fire, and blockbuster bombs dropped on Germany. Near the end, we were using 11-tonners, which crews said caused their planes to bounce up over 500 feet when the huge 25-foot missiles were released, sending up a tremendous pall of black smoke and a fountain of debris, which dwarfed the terrific explosions of the 6-ton earthquake bombs. During the war, more bombs by weight were dropped on Berlin alone than were released over the whole of England. So great was the ruin that General Eisenhower was constrained to say, "I have seen many great engineering jobs during the war, such as the clearing of the port of Cherbourg, but I just wouldn't know where to begin to rebuild Berlin." An American writer among the first group of correspondents allowed to spend more than 24 hours in the smashed metropolis of Berlin said, quote, "The capital of the Third Reich is a heap of gone, burned-out, flame-seared buildings. It is a desert of 100,000 dunes made up of brick and powdered masonry. Over this hangs the pungent stench of death. It is impossible to exaggerate in describing the destruction. Downtown Berlin looks like nothing man could have contrived. Riding down the famous Frankfurter Allee, I did not see a single building where you could have set up a business or of even selling apples." That was the story of an American war correspondent, the first one to be allowed into Berlin. All German cities above 50,000 population and many smaller ones were from 50 to 80% destroyed. Dresden, as large as Pittsburgh, was wiped out and nearly all of its 620,000 inhabitants buried under the ruins. Cologne, with a population of 750,000, was turned into a gigantic wasteland. Hamburg, with its 1,150,000 people, was blasted by huge attacks, in one of which the flames rolled a mile into the sky and roasted alive hundreds of thousands of civilians in street temperatures of 1,000 degrees. Frankfurt am Main, a city of 500,000, was reduced to a mass of rubble. All cities and industrial areas such as the Ruhr and Saar regions were laid waste. The story of Kassel typifies the tragedy which befell the others. Quote, 300 times the people of Kassel ran terrified to their air raid shelters as giant British and American planes dropped their bombs. Nearly 10,000 were killed in the first terrible bombing, the night of October the 22nd, 1943. That was largely an incendiary attack which set the whole center of the city afire. Thousands were killed in their air raid shelters by the gas fumes from great piles of burning coal, never knowing why they felt sleepy, never awakening. From that night on, they never knew when, they just knew they were doomed. Sometimes they got only a few bombs, often raiding parties which couldn't reach objectives farther east around Berlin picked Kassel on their way home. Occasionally swarms of planes went directly overhead and nothing happened. Other times they went overhead, and when the people of Kassel thought they were going on eastward, they wheeled and came back to drop their powerful tons of TNT. They knew all the tricks. Those that remained in Kassel, steadily their town was beaten down under their heads. Less than 15,000 of their 65,000 homes remained livable. They learned how to dig in, to escape the coal fumes, the fires. Somehow, I thought it was with just a touch of pride that the Burgermeister, the mayor, said, and then our latest raid, March 8th and 9th, 1945, it was by far the biggest. Perhaps 1,000 big bombers, one of the biggest raids in all Germany, and we lost very few killed, less than 100. And then, just before Easter, we heard the American armies were coming and wanted to make Kassel an open city, said Helga Aspen, a pretty blonde girl who stayed through it all. But she added bitterly, the Führerhauptquartier of Himmler gave orders to defend to the last man. And so Kassel, beaten by 300 air raids, must know the crashing of American artillery fire. They gathered about 6,000 civilians in a deep bunker in the center of town and waited, as the rather inept German defense units gradually were driven back. So on April 4th, 1945, Kassel surrendered not more than 15,000 of its 250,000 citizens still in the city living. Thousands lay buried under the countless tons of brick and mortar and twisted steel that had been dwellings and stores and factories. That was a year ago, and it's no exaggeration to say that they are still dazed. Only a few have snapped out of their stupor to become real leaders. It is not uncommon to see a person burst into helpless tears if the conversation turns to recounting the war terror. This wholesale destruction of the cities and production facilities of the most highly industrialized nation in Europe was successful from a strictly military point of view. However, it was also an attack against the livelihoods of millions of workers, for the wrecking of factories and machines is also destruction of jobs, the basic means of life. Some of Germany's jobless millions have found temporary employment in clearing rubble and similar work, but genuine reconstruction is impossible without production of vast amounts of building materials and new equipment, neither of which can be produced in Germany today, because the necessary facilities no longer exist. It takes factories and machines Germany lacks to build the factories and machines Germany needs. To get German economy off this dead center demands external assistance, and meanwhile the people unable to produce the necessities of life for themselves must either be allowed to die in masses or be given outside help until recovery has gone far enough to enable them once more to take care of themselves. In a recent symposium in Toronto, the author, James Bach, had invited historians from around the world to check into these claims that have come out, and he was one of the instrumental researchers in this case, that the Allies, in effect, and to the shame, much of it coming from the United States, the Allies, based most likely on this vitriolic hatred some of these Jewish intellectuals had for the Germans lost, according to James Bach, the leftist Canadian author, in a book called Crimes and Mercies, for which he has not found a North American publisher. Remember that. It's interesting. All the crap and the garbage and the degeneracy finds publishers in America and in Canada, but a book, naturally, that points out that 2 generations ago, genocidal maniacs were on the loose in North American planning officers that were responsible for the cold-hearted and ruthless murder by starvation of 9 million plus Germans. 9 million plus Germans. That alone ought to silence these Holocaust racketeers in inter-ethnic hatred. Whatever was true on the Holocaust supposedly perpetrated against the Jews was chicken feed compared to what America and its allies, not the brutal Soviets we want to add here, not the brutal Soviets. They were choir boys compared to what America's planners and the Western allies did to the German civilian population after 1945. Now, somebody will immediately say, but how about the care parcels that were sent to Germany? Big deal. Solving your conscience, maybe, for this murderous, genocidal idea on the Germans. And many of the care parcels and many of the help parcels came from German Americans who had immediate families in Germany. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget that. The policy on the ground was murderous. They had murder in their hearts. They didn't bring freedom to Germany when the White Star and the Red Star was hoisted over Germany. Death, destruction, dishonor, rape, robbery, pillaging, and the worst military dictatorship ever imposed on any European nation is what the Allies brought to Germany. And we will come to the Allied Control Council decisions. Harry S. Truman in his diary tells you and what Eisenhower's orders were in 1945. We Germans are talking back, and we want you to take a look in your mirror and in your archives and stop vilifying us even further. Blame the victim. This is a series of programs that unabashedly will tell from American sources, largely, of what it was like to be conquered by the Allies, both in East and West. Back to Chapter 2 of the book Gruesome Harvest, published first in 1947 in the United States, just so that you don't think I'm giving you some Nazi propaganda. Extermination by overcrowding, the territorial amputations of Germany. Germany's living space, even in 1937, was small for her heavy population and afforded important natural resources only in the form of farmlands and deposits of coal and potash. Her agricultural lands have been overworked by intensive cultivation for 1,000 to 2,000 years. And her soil has been starved for fertilizer during and since the recent war. Even when plenty of fertilizer was available, her territory was intact. Germany was never able to produce more than 80% of the food and other farm products needed to meet her domestic needs. The rest had to be imported in exchange for coal and manufactured exports. As her agricultural lands became overcrowded, Germany had resorted to manufacturing. By importing iron ore and exploiting her coal and potash resources to the utmost, she had built up the world's second largest steel and chemical industries, which in turn formed the workshop of Europe, raised the general European standard of living, and provided direct or indirect support for fully 2/3 of her own population. On account of destruction by total warfare and deliberate Allied policy, these industrial resources are now largely wiped out. Without them, over half of the German workers must resort to the soil as their only other means of life. Under the circumstances, it is extremely doubtful that the land, even if it all held in 1937 were left intact, could support a huge, now jobless industrial population on even the barest subsistence level. Without waiting to see, Germany's conquerors have ruthlessly stripped her of lands constituting 28% of her living space, producing an even higher proportion of her food and retaining 2 of her 3 principal coal regions. To make matters still worse, they are expelling into the remainder of the Reich millions of Germans from the lost provinces, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere, are coddling a large population of displaced persons within stricken Germany, and, in the case of the Russians and French, are maintaining large armies of occupation which live off the land. Both the displaced persons and these occupation forces enjoy priority over the Germans by being able to make requisitions against them for whatever food and other items they need in order to live in comparative ease and luxury. The deplorable situation created by these actions can well be imagined. Now look at what Allied policy apparently was. That's what the propaganda said anyways. The Atlantic Charter had promised, quote, no aggrandizement, no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned, the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live, to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own borders, a peace which will afford assurance that all men in all lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. Just reflect on that. We Germans looked at this brazen lie and callous statement, and it seared ourselves into our consciousness as the most utter, contemptuous, baseless, disgusting thing ever promulgated. We saw the expulsion of 17 million in the end, it turned out, of German people, and they had a nerve to say that no territorial that does not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned would take place. And then they denied the Germans the very form of government that they wanted. The Allies bombed, beat, imprisoned, tortured, and hanged out of existence the democratically elected government of Adolf Hitler and his party. What hypocrites. Of course, the Allies had promulgated a thing called the Atlantic Charter, and in that Atlantic Charter they hypocritically had promised the following: no aggrandizement, no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned, the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live, to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own borders, a peace which will afford assurance that all men in all lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. That's what the Allies said was what they were fighting for. But let's see what happened when the Allies finally conquered the Germans, and if the Germans have a justified beef against how they were deceived. The right of nations to live in safety in their own borders and so on, well, it didn't happen to the German generation in 1945. In their Yalta statement, the Big Three affirm their faith in the principles of the Atlantic Charter and say they uphold the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they live. Let me just interject here, then why not allow the Germans the same right? Why forbid the National Socialist German Workers' Party, as the Allies did as soon as they came to power? After all, why didn't have the Allies the nerve or the guts to have open, free and democratic elections? Why did they have to incarcerate and imprison the leaders? If they say that nations could choose the form of government under which they wanted to live, why not grant it to the Germans? So it was a bold-faced lie right from the beginning, because Germany's leaders of the ruling party in Germany that was elected democratically, remember, in democratic elections and reaffirmed in plebiscites, was by that time imprisoned wholesale. But we will come to that. So this is lie number one. The Germans had no choice, that they were given the government that they wanted to have. The Allies imposed first the military dictatorship, and later on Quisling governments. And that's the reality of the German situation for the last 60 years. It's still this way. Since 1944-45, the German people, regardless of what area of Europe, east or west, they lived under, they have lived under Allied imposed systems, quislings, and governments. Not freely elected by the Germans, because they had no choice. The conquerors dictated to them whom they could and could not have as leaders. So let's cut out the hyperbole and crap and the dishonesty. Back to the book, Gruesome Harvest. Yet in the same pronouncements, they grant Russia the eastern half of Poland, and as compensation promise the Poles substantial accessions of territory in eastern Germany, all without regard to the wishes of the peoples concerned, freely expressed or otherwise, as the Atlantic Charter had promised. Although Yalta prescribes that the exact amount of such territory Poland is to receive must await final adjudication at the peace conference, Russia at Potsdam confronted her two Western allies with a territorial fait accompli. She had taken a third of East Prussia as her own permanent acquisition and had placed her Polish puppet in possession of all other German territory east of the Oder-Neisse rivers. Even the drastic Morgenthau Plan, promulgated by this June United States Secretary of the Treasury, had called for ceding Poland only the part of East Prussia not taken by Russia and the Upper Silesian coal and industrial region. But in addition to these areas, Poland had now possessed herself of German Posen, nearly all of Pomerania and Lower Silesia, and the eastern part of Brandenburg, the best part of the Reich's breadbasket. In urging her two allies to accept these acquisitions as permanent, Russia argued that so many German inhabitants had fled when the Red Armies invaded that to get the regions back into production would require their incorporation into the Russian and Polish economies along the lines already drawn. Russia's seizure of Königsberg and adjacent East Prussian territory was accepted at Potsdam and has since gone unopposed. Renamed Kaliningrad, the former East Prussian capital, has been developed into a prized warm water port for the Soviet Union. Most of the German inhabitants have been ousted and the whole region has been thoroughly Russified. But concerning German lands held by Poland, Potsdam decides that the final delineation of the western frontier of Poland should await the peace settlement. However, it permits the territories to be held meanwhile under the administration of the Polish state, apparently looking upon this arrangement as tantamount to the de facto recognition of her title to the regions. Poland has proceeded to dispossess and drive out the millions of German inhabitants and to replace them with Poles. No territorial changes, it said in the Atlantic Charter, to go with the freely expressed wishes of the people concerned. Bull. Bull. The Allied leaders were just cunning, two-faced, bold-faced liars. And the result has now been cemented by German quislings into what they think is a permanent settlement. Well, let me tell you, let me quote you Abraham Lincoln again, the American president, who said, "Nothing is settled permanently unless it is settled equitably." And in the East, nothing has been settled equitably. Therefore, don't expect that is settled permanently. France, meanwhile, has waged a bitter fight to deprive Germany of its vital western areas, insisting that the Reich must be permanently weakened by economic and political dismemberment. She demanded that the Ruhr be detached and internationalized, that the Rhineland be turned into an autonomous state, and that she be allowed to annex the rich Saar, coal, and industrial region, placing settlement of these questions and her exorbitant reparations claims above all bilateral agreements and alliances. She attempted to force the issue by blocking all Allied attempts to treat Germany as an economic whole. Prior to the Molotov coup at Paris, France had been supported in her territorial claims against Germany by French communists with Moscow's backing. But just as she was making her strongest appeal for Allied approval for her severe plans for Western Germany, Molotov suddenly abandoned her and made his unexpected bid for German territorial unity and support, rejecting outright the proposed internationalization of the Ruhr and by implication French annexation of the Saar. He quoted from Stalin's speech of November 2nd, 1942, in which he had said that it is just as impossible to destroy Germany as to destroy Russia, opposing any a la mode plans to dismember or pastoralize the Reich, or to turn it into a federation or confederation of small states, as had been proposed. He demanded full power control and administration of the Ruhr. Now let me just interject here that this plan in this book called Germany Must Perish by this Jewish intellectual writer, friend of speechwriter for Roosevelt, reviewed widely in the United States, has a map at the end of it that shows Germany being divided amongst its neighbors. This book came out in 1941, before the war broke out between Germany and the United States. So the booklet that I am quoting you from, Gruesome Harvest, and the policies adopted by the Allies after the war certainly reflect some of the thinking in this book. Back to the booklet, Gruesome Harvest. Despite this stinging Russian rejection of territorial changes in Western Germany, the United States, in exchange for a French promise to cease blocking German treatment of Germany as an economic whole, promised to back French claims to the Saar, which France thereupon began to enlarge by annexing adjoining areas. But at Stuttgart, Mr. Burns, after repeating the promise to support the French claim to the Saar, followed Mr. Molotov's example and opposed detachment of the Ruhr and Rhineland. His stand, supported by both Russia and Britain, will undoubtedly force substantial moderation in future of French claims. Burns declared that apart from the Saar and the eastern territories to go to Russia and to Poland, as decided at the peace conference, the United States will not support any encroachment on territory which is indisputably German, or any division of Germany which is not genuinely desired by the people concerned. So far as the United States is aware, the people of the Ruhr and the Rhineland desire to remain united with the rest of Germany, and the United States will not oppose their desire. With the exception, noted Mr. Burns, herewith telling effect, apply to Germany the principles of the Atlantic Charter. There should be no exceptions. If these principles apply to the Ruhr and Rhineland as they do, they apply with equal force to the Saar and to German territories east of the Oder-Neisse line. Such principles cannot be used merely as convenient trumps in the sordid game of power politics without convincing the world, including the Germans, that our stand is unprincipled, inherently contradictory, and prejudiced, that in consequence they are being unjustly deprived of territory vital to their very existence. The Germans have long suffered from acute overpopulation. In earlier years, they sought relief in colonies and heavy emigration, which incidentally brought us the large German element in our own population. Later, they resorted to intensive industrialization. After World War I, they were stripped of their colonies. Immigration was impeded by barriers such as immigration quotas, and their homeland was reduced from 208,830 to 181,699 square miles. So remember, the Germans already lost almost 30,000 square miles in the First World War, in the same disgusting method that was practiced against them again in the Second World War. Following World War II, immigration has been entirely prohibited, and all the Germans in Europe are being jammed into a homeland further slashed to only 133,000 square miles. Although Germany's population is half as large as our own, her territory in 1937 was only 1/16th as large as the United States. Let me repeat that for Americans. So in 1937, when Germany was almost double what it was today, after more land was stolen with American acquiescence, Germany in 1937 was only 1/16th as large as the United States, or about equal to the combined areas of Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Since the present losses to Poland, Russia, and France subtract an area as large as Pennsylvania, they mean that 70 million Germans are being crammed into a territory no larger than Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. Imagine trying to force half the people of the United States into these 3 states with their cities, factories, railways, and other production facilities demolished by war. That's the reality, what I'm trying to tell people in Canada, America, and the rest of the world. That was the reality that I and my generation lived through in 1945. Can you not understand how it rankles us when we hear your facile, disgustingly surfacey, ignorant commentaries about things German, when you reduce everything down to Auschwitz and what you allege took place there, and browbeat a proud people with a long history who struggled valiantly for good principles. Good principles. Good principles. Honesty, loyalty, pride, purity of their own kind and race, yes. An economic system that the bankers, many of them called gangsters, banksters of the world, the big multinational corporations, could not compete against. That's what the Germans fought for. Those were their ideals. And we are sick and tired of having everything reduced to what you claim happened in Auschwitz and in Dachau and in other places. The resultant population compression is tremendous. Thinking people in France are justly worried that it will bring another violation of their territory, impelled by millions of desperate Germans faced by extermination through overcrowding. Diplomacy which creates such power cakes is singularly lacking in statesmanship and humanity. It makes sense only in terms of Soviet designs. Now let's look at the mass expulsion of Germans from outside areas into the shrunken German Reich, into that small 133,000 square miles that was left. The forced exodus of Germans from the lost German territories and elsewhere in Eastern Europe constitutes one of the blackest pages of history. Potsdam gives its permission by saying that the transfer to Germany of German populations or elements thereof remaining in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary will have to be undertaken. However, it adds, any transfers that take place should be effected in an orderly and humane manner. Some 15 million people are victimized by this decree. 500,000 from Hungary, nearly 3 million from Czechoslovakia, and most of the rest from the German territories taken by Russia and Poland. Potsdam calls for the annulment of all Nazi laws which establish discrimination on grounds of race and declares, quote, no such discrimination, whether legal, administrative, or otherwise, shall be tolerated, end of quote. Yet, these forced migrations of German populations are predicated squarely on rank racial discrimination. The people affected are mostly wives and children of simple peasants, workers, artisans whose family have lived for centuries in the homes from which they have now been ejected, and whose only offense is their German blood. How orderly and humane their banishment has been is now a matter of record. Winston Churchill was not exaggerating when, in referring to the expulsion some 3 months after VE Day, he informed the House of Commons in the following quote, It is not impossible. A tragedy on a prodigious scale is imposing itself behind the Iron Curtain, which presently divides Europe." End of quote. The conservative newsletter Review of World Affairs quotes as follows from a confidential memorandum prepared by an eminent European economist. "Since the end of the war, about 3 million people, mostly women and children, and overaged men have been killed in eastern Germany and southern Eastern Europe. About 15 million people have been deported or had to flee from their homesteads and are on the road. About 25% of these people, over 3 million, have perished. About 4 million men and women have been deported to Eastern Europe and Russia as slaves. It seems that the elimination of the German population of Eastern Europe, at least 15 million, was planned in accordance with decisions made at Yalta. Churchill had said to Mikołajczyk, when the latter protested during the negotiations at Moscow against forcing Poland to incorporate East Germany, "Don't mind the 5 or more million Germans. Stalin will see to them. You will have no trouble with them. They will cease to exist." That's Churchill. Dr. Lawrence Meyer, Executive Secretary of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, after a tour of Germany, stated, "About 16 million German refugees east of the Oder are being deported from their homes. It has been estimated that already 10 million have been driven out. The human tragedy and suffering caused by this Volkswanderung are unparalleled in history. Hunger, cold, sickness, and death is the lot of millions. An authentic eyewitness report of the physical wretchedness of most of the refugees is pictured in the following. A large barge is slowly being towed across the Oder River. In it, lying on straw, are 300 children ranging from 2 to 14 years of age. There is hardly a sign of life in the whole group. They are hollow eyes, their swollen bellies, knees, feet are telltale signs of starvation. These are merely the vanguards of hundreds of thousands, millions of homeless, shattered, hungry, sick, helpless, hopeless human beings fleeing westward, west of the Oder and Neisse rivers. A trust in God, His goodness, His mercy. These are the only hope of Germany today, and thank God in many there is still faith in God, against which the gates of hell have stormed in vain during the past decades." In describing the expulsions in Poland and Czechoslovakia, Russian officers told the Chicago Daily News correspondents the following: "The Poles have cleaned out all the Germans as far west as the Oder River, and now all that property is for any Poles who want it. The Czechs have taken care of the Germans in Sudetenland in their own way, and it's not pretty. They round them up with only what they can carry and start them moving." Upon returning to this post as professor of political science at the University of Michigan after serving 14 months as a director of American Military Government's Regional Government Coordinating Office, Dr. James K. Pollock in August 1946 said most of the 2.25 million expellees from Hungary and the Sudetenland are old women and children. He said, "The Germans we are getting are mostly from the Sudetenland, or Germans whose family had been living in Hungary for some 500 years. They come in perfectly frightful condition. They even took the women's wedding rings before they left. In many cases, they have no clothes except what they are wearing." You know what that does to me, a German, reading this again. It's one of the reasons why I can hardly go through this material. It infuriates me. It infuriates me. It infuriates me that Americans, Canadians, and Britishers, people of my own kind, ethnic origin and race, could acquiesce to such a policy. That Nathan Kaufman, the Jewish intellectual, that Morgenthau, the Jewish planner with a cold heart and vengeance on their mind, could concoct such plans, that's one thing. Driven by hate, as they were and still are, obviously. When I read that book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, recently published by Daniel Goldhagen, an assistant professor at Harvard University. These people have hate in their hearts, murder in their minds. And here we see the fruits of it. And we Germans are supposed to take these shrill accusations and this crap heaved in our direction for the last 50 years, while these expulsions that I've just read you from in an American-produced book based on American testimony by people, Americans who were there, part of the military government, while they were going on, while this murder, mayhem, robbery, destruction, and rape was going on, other Americans were sitting in justice over Germans because they apparently, in very orderly, very, very small scale, had relocated people to different places. That is what irks us Germans, the hypocrisy. The hypocrisy. And it justifies Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone of the United States Supreme Court's claim that what Jackson was running in Nuremberg was nothing but a high-grade lynching party. And just so that you don't get on your high horse and says the Germans had it coming to them, these warmongers, and they had plotted world conquest, which is running off the lips of so many. Well, here's a book, Forrestal Diaries, published by Viking Press and by the former Secretary of War in the United States. Certainly a substantial and important book. In his diary entry, 27th December 1945, records that he was playing golf with Joe Kennedy, the father of Joseph Kennedy, who had been the ambassador to England by Roosevelt. And he quotes Chamberlain as saying that the Germans would not have fought after attacking Russia, that Hitler would have fought Russia without any later conflict with England if it had not been for American meddling. And then he says, Kennedy reports that Chamberlain then says, he stated that America and the world's Jews had forced England into the war. So, here is the Forrestal Diaries quoting the father of President Kennedy in a conversation with Chamberlain, the man who ought to have known what was going on through British minds, saying that England was forced into the Second World War. England, in effect, was forced into a war with Germany, which only made it a world war. Before that, it was a border dispute between Germany and Poland, a justified border dispute, by the way, because the Poles had once again seized all kinds of German territory after the First World War to which they were not entitled. We have done just previous programs on this. The truncation of Germany. Germany, after the First World War, lost almost 30,000 square miles of its eastern territory. And this is where these millions of Germans were living that Hitler had to protect. Now, in 1982, the Israelis invaded Lebanon, killed, it is thought, 58,000 people because one Israeli diplomat was wounded in a London hotel lobby. A little Mickey Mouse terrorist state of Israel attacked Lebanon, killed that many people indiscriminately through bombing in refugee camps and all this because one of their diplomats got wounded. And Hitler was not supposed to do something about the murder of thousands and thousands in Poland, in places like Bromberg and so on. Only people who have and know no history, like unfortunately so many Anglo-Saxons of the last 2-3 generations, could go and fall for the shallow arguments of the Holocaust promotion lobby. And just because you have been told that the Germans have this warlike passion and are warlike people out of your own linguistic area, comes the following. Professor Harry Elmer Barnes, an American historian who analyzed and studied German bellicosity, German warlikeness, had said England has been way out in front in point of relative bellicosity among nations, while Germany and the Netherlands stand at the very bottom of the list next to Denmark. And Quincy Wright, in his study of war, wherein he shows in the period from 1480 to 1940, there were 278 wars in Europe involving European countries, and that the percentage of participation by these European countries lists before the Germans come in second to last place, which includes Prussia, okay? England, France, Spain, Russia, Austria, Turkey, Poland, Sweden, Italy, Netherlands, and only then Germany with 8%, including Prussia. And if you had removed Prussia, Germany would have been in last place behind Denmark. And then if you take, likewise, Pitrim Sorokin, in Volume 3, Part 2 of his Social and Cultural Dynamics, shows from the 12th century to 1925, the percentage of the years in which leading European powers have been at war, that the Germans are in absolute last place. So get off your high horses in impugning that the Germans are this warlike nation. Now, but let's look at the Allied record. Let's look at the Allied record. The peace and freedom and democracy that allegedly the Allies brought to the German people. Upon returning to his post as professor of political science at the University of Michigan after serving 14 months as a director of the American military government's Regional Government Coordinating Office, Dr. James K. Pollock, in August 1946, said most of the 2.25 million expellees from Hungary and the Sudetenland are old women and children. An officer would call at the door of the victims and order them out of their home, to leave their home within a few hours, permitting them to take along 30 to 100 pounds of luggage containing nothing of value, which might help them in making a new start elsewhere. The property forcibly left behind would be confiscated by the state. Any able-bodied men found would be hustled off to slavery. The others would then start their perilous hegira to overcrowded Germany, wholly without protection of law, subject to every conceivable abuse, including robbery, beatings, rape, and murder. A dispatch in December 1945 paints a picture of the plight of the exiles in the New Poland, where hundreds of thousands had been ousted from their homes and left to wander where they would. Former German cities like Breslau are described as almost depopulated of Germans, with Poles taking their place. The dispatch goes on to say, hundreds of thousands of persons in Poland are constantly on the move, restlessly seeking a spot where they can grub a living out of the war-ravaged land. In every rail station and junction, men, women, and children await transport. Clusters of human beings, almost hidden under loads of parcels and cans and other remnants of what must have been their homes, wait along the roads or in blasted villages for any transport that will carry them somewhere else. Life with its births and deaths continue even in these nomadic streams, and everywhere you see women folk tending their sick and nursing babies. An eyewitness report of the arrival in Berlin of a train which had left Poland with exactly 1,000 refugees aboard reads as follows. 990 men, women and children dragged themselves and their luggage from a Russian railway train at Leherde station today, after 11 days traveling in boxcars from Poland. Red Army soldiers lifted 91 corpses from the train, while relatives shrieked and sobbed as their bodies were piled in American Lend-Lease trucks and driven off for the internment in a pit near a concentration camp. The refugee train was like a macabre Noah's Ark. Every car was jammed with Germans. The families carry all their earthly belongings in sacks, bags, and tin trunks. Nursing infants suffer the most, as their mothers are unable to feed them, and frequently go insane as they watch their offspring slowly die before their eyes. Today, 4 screaming, violently insane mothers were bound with rope to prevent them from clawing other passengers. Many women try to carry off their dead babies with them, a Russian railway official said. We search the bundles whenever we discover a weeping woman, to make sure she is not carrying an infant corpse with her. New York Daily News correspondent Donald Mackenzie likewise reports from Berlin. In the windswept courtyard of the Stettiner Bahnhof, a cohort of German refugees, part of 12 million to 19 million dispossessed in East Prussia and Silesia, sat in groups under driving rain and told the story of their miserable pilgrimage, during which more than 25% died by the roadside, and the remainder were so starved they scarcely had strength to walk. Filthy, emaciated, and carrying their few remaining possessions, wrapped in bits of cloth, they shrank away, crouching when one approached them in the railway terminal, expecting to be beaten or robbed or worse. That is what they have become accustomed to expect. A nurse from Stettin, a young, good-looking blonde, told how her father had been stabbed to death by Russian soldiers, who, after raping her mother and sister, tried to break into her own room. She escaped and hid in a haystack with 4 other women for 4 days. On the train to Berlin, she was pillaged once by Russian troops and twice by Poles. Women who resisted were shot dead, she said, and on one occasion she saw a guard take an infant by the legs and crush its skull against the post because the child cried while the guard was raping its mother. An old peasant from Silesia said victims were robbed of everything they had, even their shoes. Infants were robbed of their swaddling cloths so that they froze to death. All the healthy girls and women, even those 65 years of age, were raped in the train and then robbed, the peasant said. Precedent for this inhuman expulsion was set long before Potsdam in Romania, where, according to a diplomatic report from Bucharest, 520,000 Romanian citizens of German ancestry, men between the ages of 17 and 45, and women between 18 and 30, were rounded up like slaves and deported to Soviet Russia. The document said there were heart-rending scenes and many preferred suicide to an unknown fate in Soviet Russia. The United States had made its own direct contribution by ousting more than 16,000 people of German extraction from Latin American countries, obtaining permission to do so by pressures of various kinds applied from Washington, extraditing them without trial to this country, holding them here in concentration camps incommunicado, and still without trial, and finally deporting them out of this hemisphere, where many of them have been impressed into slavery by England and France. Let me repeat that for you Americans. I don't know if you knew this, but this is an episode that you are not told in very many American history books, that the Roosevelt administration leaned on most Latin American countries that were willing to do it. Brazil was one of the first to do it, and so did others, usually because of the greed of local leaders or local politicians who coveted the wealth and the factories and the homes and the estancias and so on of these frugal, hard-working German colonists that had lived there for hundreds of years. And so the United States forced these countries to expel their native German population. They were put on cattle boats. They were brought to American ports, I think it was Houston, and then they were taken to Fort Worth, processed there, arrested, because they illegally entered the United States without proper papers. Then were put into concentration camps. When the war ended, these Brazilians, Ecuadorians, Panamanians, and all these other Germans were then not shipped back to their country of origin where they were born, where they had lived for generations. No, they were expelled by the United States into bombed-out Europe, many times Germany. How do I know? I interviewed quite a number of them. So don't you accuse the Germans of all those misdeeds. In your name, all these things happened. And I ask you speaking from the bottom of my soul for my own people that have been disenfranchised, vilified, cowed and clubbed into submission. Where were your fathers, your mothers, your grandmothers, your grandfathers? I heard no one speak up against these injustices in your countries. It happened in Canada, it happened in America, it happened in England. I know one case, for instance, of a small colony of Germans who were in Palestine for, I think, 3 or 4 generations, had 7 thriving villages. They called themselves Templars. How Jewish police, auxiliary police, deputized by the British military forces, rounded these people up just in the same way that I've just been reading you from, and shipped them first to Egypt and then into the deserts of Australia. And how after lengthy negotiations long after the war, of course the Jews never gave them back their villages, never allowed them back into Israel. They paid them $1.13 for every $100 of the property stolen. Some of them are still on my mailing list, still alive. These wholesale expulsions of native populations are as reprehensible as anything the Nazis are accused of doing, and have caused deep resentment amongst all classes of Germans. Had America kept her skirts clear, and especially if she had denounced them, as she should have done, German respect for us would have soared. As matters stand, Germans blame us almost as much as the Russians and Poles. Our hands too are stained with the blood of millions of innocent victims of this savage, thoroughly un-American program. Apart from the moral aspects of the matter, the dumping of all these millions of expropriated, helpless people into what remains of wrecked Germany piles chaos upon chaos and helps convert the entire German nation into one vast Belsen or Buchenwald. Let me tell you, this little booklet has more disgusting behavior by the Allied policymakers, Allied government leaders, Allied bureaucrats. English, French, Russian, American. Believe me, you have nothing to be proud of. Nothing. Nothing. Nichts. Your record is dismal. Disgusting. Why? You claim to have had democratic forms of government. You elected those leaders. The Germans, at least, have the luxury to point to their dictatorship. You have told them that they lived under a dictatorship, and yet you held them collectively responsible. Well, let me tell you, as a son of those Germans that marched to the gates of Stalingrad trying to subdue Stalin's monstrous Gulag Empire, which only 50 years later President Reagan had the courage and the honesty to call an evil empire. My father and his generation were at the ramparts of Moscow when you bombed us back to the Stone Age. And after a valiant struggle to free Europe and the world from this menace against civilization called Bolshevism, you had the nerve to propagandize against these people who tried to accomplish that to save your bacon as American, Canadian, British, Australian, and other English-speaking capitalists. Get off our back. We are tired. Tired. From now on, we intend to rub your noses into your record. The German people basically are not very vindictive people. For 50 years, the Quisling government, even the Quislings you have installed, try to buy off all the former enemies. But no amount of money, over 100 billion marks paid alone to the state of Israel in ill-gotten gains, has given the Germans any relief. The vilification continues. The hate-mongering continues. Hollywood cranks out the anti-German, bigoted hate films. The latest one, Spielberg's Schindler's List. And the latest outrage, this blood libel against the German people perpetrated by Daniel Goldhagen, assistant professor at Harvard University, with his disgusting book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. Other hypocrites and Holocaust promoters like Raoul Hilberg from Vermont University and Dr. Christopher Browning and some of the other liars for hire at least had the decency, if you want to call it, the decency or the tactical cunning to say that the German nation didn't know frequently what was happening, that it was a secret plan, and that the common people didn't know about all that was happening. No, Goldhagen says everybody knew. The whole German nation was willing as a nation of executioners. Well, there is some revisionist work coming, and I say to you, if the Germans can be blamed for being a nation of willing executioners, how about those people who put out this book in the United States, Germany Must Perish, a plan for the extermination of the German people? And according to James Pack, the Canadian writer, 9 million Germans were murdered in cold blood as a direct result of Allied policies by people like Kaufmann, by people like Morgenthau. Now, the one executioner of this plan, the executor in Europe of the plan, was none other than this man, an American idol, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I used to be a big kind of a hero worshipper of Eisenhower because, of course, when I went to school, occupied school in Germany after the war, he was the big hero. And it took me years and years before I would acknowledge to myself, living here in North America, that later on President Eisenhower was a man who hated Germans with deep passion. And only now do I begin to realize why General Zhukov bestowed on him at the Order of Stalin the highest medal given to any foreigner. And it is fitting that this should have taken place in Berlin. I can imagine how the Soviets were laughing all the way back to the Kremlin that they had found in Dwight D. Eisenhower a willing executioner of Soviet policy. And I remember later on when Robert Welch, much maligned head of the John Birch Society in the early 60s, wrote a book called Ike, the Politician. This is when my eyes began to be opened. But the true extent of Eisenhower's hatred towards the German, I really could only find in this book by a Canadian author. It's called Other Losses. It became a Canadian bestseller, and promotional headline here says, the American and French armies caused about 1 million German prisoners of war to die starting in April 1945. The deaths were officially listed as other losses. The Montreal Gazette, the largest English-language newspaper in the province of Quebec, called this book one of the biggest stories of the century. Now, this biggest story of the century, of course, was very much suppressed in the United States, and still is. It's kind of interesting that the American media never tires of dishing out and moralizing about German misdeeds, real and imagined, believe me, real and imagined, and yet is so cowardly and suppresses a book that became a bestseller in Canada, Other Losses. You can hardly find it in any American bookstore. And even here in Canada, forces initially shocked by the revelation of James Back, and this article in one of the most reputable magazines in Canada, Saturday Night, a very old Canadian intellectual magazine, had Dwight Eisenhower on the front cover, and it says, Eisenhower's Death Camps, the Last Dirty Secret of World War II, on page 35. And that's the September issue of 1989. It's a classic. It's a classic. You can find it in Canadian libraries. And here it says, Eisenhower himself signed the request to create a prisoner category not covered by the Geneva Convention. And I have a map here on page 35. It says the prisoner of war camps clustered all along the Rhine marked the final successful Allied thrust into Germany. The U.S. Army officially took 5.25 million prisoners. And then it shows, of course, the photos by the United States Army of these German prisoners, how they live in these open fields. And, of course, that were turned into mud holes, and many of them died in those mud holes as soon as it started to rain. Let me just quote to you from this article in Saturday Night Magazine, September 1989, page 37. He says, "This headquarters is having considerable difficulty in establishing adequate basis for requisitioning rations for prisoners of war currently held in the theater. In response to inquiries from this headquarters, several varying statements of number of prisoners held in the theater have been published by SHAFE." He then cites the latest SHAFE statement. Quote, "Cable dated 31st May states 1,890,000 prisoners of war and 1,200,000 disarmed German forces on hand. Best known available figure at this headquarters show prisoners of war in COM-Z 910,980, in COM-Z transient enclosures 1,422,000, and in 12th Army GP 965,135, making a total of 2,878,537, and an additional 1 million disarmed German forces, Germany and Austria. The situation was astounding. Lee was reporting 1 million more men in the U.S. Army camps in Europe than SHAFE said it had on its books. But he was wrestling with the wind. He had to base his issue of food on the number of prisoners on hand supplied to him by SHAFE G3 operations. Given the general turmoil, fluctuating and inaccurate tallies were probably inevitable, but more than 1 million captives can actually be seen disappearing between the two reports of the theater provost marshal issued on the same day, June 2nd, the last in a series of daily reports. From the TPM logs, 2,807,400 prisoners of war on hand at June 2nd. The first report of the new weekly series dated the same day says that there are only 1,836,000 on hand. At one point in the middle of June, the prisoner strength on the ration list was shown as 1,421,559, while on Lee's and other evidence there were probably almost 3 times that number. Spreading the rations thinner was one way to guarantee starvation. Another was accomplished by some strange army bookkeeping during June and July. 1 million prisoners who had been received at least some food because of their nominal POW status lost their rights in their food when they were secretly transferred to the disarmed enemy forces status. The shift was made deliberately over many weeks with careful attention paid to maintaining plausible balances in SHAFE's weekly POW reports and disarmed enemy forces reports. The discrepancy between those shifted from POW status during the period from June 2nd to July 28th and those received in the DEF status is only 0.43%. The reclassification to DEF did not require any transfer of men to new camps or involve any new organization to get German civilian supplies to them. The men stayed where they were. All that happened was that by the clatter of a typewriter, their skimpy bit of U.S. Army food was stopped. And here is why I wanted you to get a little feel for Dwight D. Eisenhower's methods with his disarmed enemy forces, which he created, which was totally outside the Geneva Convention, and therefore he wasn't responsible for the feeding, the medical attention, the upkeep, the housing of over 1 million, between 1 and 2 million German prisoners, one of them being my father. Pulling down the pillar of labor in Germany, according to Gruesome Harvest, the policy of enslavement. Allied attacks against German manpower have produced along 3 main fronts enslavement, denazification, and physical incapacitation through undernourishment. Our present discussion will take up the first 2 of these. with starvation postponed for special treatment. President Roosevelt, on October the 21st, 1944, promised that the German people are not going to be enslaved because the United Nations do not traffic in human misery. In the preceding month at Quebec, however, he had used strong pressure to obtain Mr. Churchill's acceptance of the Morgenthau Plan, which called for forced German labor outside Germany. Pravda writer Boris Isakov wrote that when in the following February at Yalta, the proposal was advanced to force German workers to rebuild war-damaged areas, President Roosevelt called this a healthy idea. It was at this meeting that Roosevelt pressed the Morgenthau Plan and won Mr. Stalin's ominously ready acceptance. Although at Potsdam it was solemnly promised again that it is not the intention of the Allies to enslave the German people, thousands of Germans had already been marched eastward into Russia's yawning slave camps. More than a month earlier, on June 29, 1945, the following had been published. Quote, German prisoners in Russian hands are estimated to number from 4 to 5 millions. When Berlin and Breslau surrendered, the long gray columns of prisoners were marched east, downcast and fearful, toward huge depots near Leningrad, Moscow, Minsk, Stalingrad, Kiev, Kharkov, and Sevastopol. All fit men had to march some 22 miles a day. Those physically handicapped went in handcarts or carts pulled by spare beasts. They will be made to rebuild the Russian towns and villages which they destroyed. They will not return home until the work is completed. It has long been an open secret that Russia maintains, under the direction of the NKVD, secret police, a vast army of Russian slaves, varying in number from 10 to 20 millions, mainly recruited as political unreliables. The presence and importance of this huge slave force explains, among other things, the profitability and frequency of Soviet Russia's many purges. They are primarily a device for rounding up prisoners for enslavement. It is not surprising, therefore, that the Soviet Union should jump at the opportunity to enslave millions of defeated enemy civilians and soldiers and to avoid special criticism. Induce her allies to do likewise. Now remember, I quoted to you from Saturday Night Magazine, the last dirty secret of World War II, in which they state that America had 5.25 million prisoners that the U.S. Army took, and here we have that the Soviet Army took 5 million. So, in other words, just about the same number of prisoners. Now, recently the Soviet archives opened because communism collapsed, and lo and behold, it was found out that the Soviets had kept a dossier on a single dossier on every single German POW. All those also who died. 465,000 died. Now that means fewer German soldiers died in Soviet's vicious Gulag system than died at the hands of the Americans. The only difference is that the Russians kept files for each soldier and each person who died. And now, since their system collapsed, we at least know about the fate of these men. Apparently, President Eisenhower's cover-up and whitewash was so complete and has been so complete that it is far more difficult to reconstruct. James Buck did, up to a point, in this book. And this Canadian author, James Buck, also has tried to have another book published called Crimes and Mercy, which deal with the same subject except expanded, in which he says that because of this Allied policy promulgated mainly in the United States by these vindictive individuals such as Henry Morgenthau, and of course egged on by thinkers by Theodor Nathan Kaufman and others of his ilk, 9 million German people died after the war. Not during the war, after the war. That was the Holocaust of the Germans. And I intend to bring it to the attention of the American public and to the Canadian public and to the Australian, all English speakers of the world. Whatever happens to me is immaterial. I've been dragged through jails and courts, and now I face again some kangaroo proceedings in Ottawa. I bequeath to the English-speaking world, with my strong German accent, a little bit of evidence that you can continue to research on and find out what was done in your name and in your father's name, or maybe in which your father and grandfather participated. We basically want our reputation back and restored, our honor restored. We're tired of having our German heritage besmirched by a bunch of liars for hire, by people who have lots of skeletons in their closet. And we are tired of people who sit in glass houses, constantly heaving rocks at us Germans. And I am one German that is picking up the rocks that have been heaved at us, and I am heaving them back. So back to the dismal record of the Allies. A few crippled and ailing Germans who have survived the ordeal have been returned from the Russian slave camps to Berlin, where American correspondents have obtained first-hand accounts of what is happening. German Red Cross girls went at 9 a.m. on the morning of September 10, 1946, to meet a 20-car trainload of returning forced laborers. As the sealed cars were opened by the armed guards who had been riding on top, the girls were greeted with thin, scabby-faced men in rags begging for water or hysteriously calling for help in removing the dead. A professional nurse told the story. They had been in the train almost a week, traveling about 60 miles from Frankfurt on Oder. There had been deaths from starvation, not from starvation just during the ride, but from the hardships of the trip after months of malnutrition in Russian labor camps. Almost all of the 800 or 900 in the train were sick or cripples. You might say they were invalids. With 40 to 50 packed in each of those little boxcars, the sick had to sleep beside the dead on their homeward journey. I did not count them, but I'm sure we removed more than 25 corpses. Others had to be taken to hospitals. I asked several of the men whether the Russian guards or doctors had done anything on the trip to care for them. They said no. I met only one alert, healthy man in the lot, and I have seen him since. He was just a kid of 17. The boy told me that prisoners leaving Russian camps for Germany are searched to prevent any from smuggling mail for their comrades. Therefore, when one of them has been diagnosed as a hopeless invalid in anticipation of discharge, he will memorize the names and addresses of relatives to whom he can report for his fellow prisoners. He said, only prisoners in special favor are able to mail postcards to their nearest of kin. The kid of 17 had memorized 80 names and addresses in Berlin of relatives of his prison friends. He found the buildings at most of the addresses in rubble, with the present whereabouts of the former occupants unknown, but he visited all 80 addresses in the first 6 days in Berlin. I want to come back to page 19 of this booklet, Gruesome Harvest, put out in the United States in 1947. Because when the Soviets began to march 5 million prisoners east to what they claimed the rebuilding of the Soviet Union, blaming them for the destruction, the footnote is interesting that the author, Ralph Keeling, makes. When it was learned that the Soviets were impressing German civilian personnel for service in factories being removed to Russia, Britain and the United States protested. In reply, the Russians produced a proclamation signed by General Dwight Eisenhower a year earlier, requiring that German authorities must carry out any measures of restitution, reinstatement, restoration, reparation, reconstruction, relief, or rehabilitation as the Allied representatives might prescribe to accomplish which the Germans must provide such transportation, plant, equipment and materials of all kinds, labor, personnel, specialists and other services for use in Germany or elsewhere, as the Allied representatives may direct. Since the document did not require four-nation agreement, the Russians are permitted by it to act unilaterally. After it was produced, Britain and the United States had to withdraw their protest. In other words, this man, Dwight Eisenhower, was not only responsible for the mistreatment, starvation, callous murder of millions of Germans under his command in the West, he also gave the Soviet Union the proclamation, the justification to do the same thing to Germans in the East. And he is an American icon. Let me get back to Gruesome Harvest. The daily diet in Russian slave camps is soup and lectures on the glories of communism and the evils of Western democracy. The slightest disobedience is penalized by such heavy work that a third of the culprits die within 3 weeks from exhaustion. A tenth of the slaves died during the first year, according to those who have returned. If prisoners released by the Russians as unfit for further forced labor happen to recuperate, they are re-impressed and sent back for more. Moreover, able-bodied Germans we have released who have returned to their former homes in the Russian zone are arrested by the Russians and sent to the Soviet Union for enslavement, on the pretext that they have been rendered politically unreliable through exposure to British or American influences. Refusal of released prisoners to return to the Russian zone has created a major problem, which France has attempted to meet by permitting the men to remain in France, a special class of citizens. When the war ended, we Americans enjoyed a decided advantage over the Russians in German esteem. Aware of the barbarities of the NKVD's treatment of slaves, that's the Russian secret police, German soldiers did their best to avoid falling into the hands of the Red Armies, preferring instead to surrender to the British or Americans. German prisoners who were to be turned over to the Russians often committed suicide or tried to incapacitate themselves by slashing their bodies with knives, razors, or bits of glass. Persistent reports coming from Russia, however, tell of large numbers of German prisoners joining the Red Army after indoctrination in communism, and justify the fear that ultimately a huge German prison army in Russia may be successfully converted into a potent military force which may someday be turned against the West. Then Ralph Franklin Keeling, in his book Gruesome Harvest, continues and turns his eyes on the French treatment of prisoners and how the French got these prisoners and so on. Before I do that, and just to kind of underpin this story about the feared German prisoner army, East Germany, the slave state America allowed the Soviets to build up, was really a military communist dictatorship, and lucky that the Russian motherland collapsed, because otherwise, let me tell you, from the studies that NATO has done since of the military preparedness of the East German forces alone, the East German forces were in a state of readiness and could have moved from a signal out of the barracks onto their tanks within 5 minutes, an incredible state of readiness in 1989. The Soviet forces had a kind of a state of readiness of 15 minutes. That means at any one time, tens of thousands of German, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were in a permanent state of military readiness. And their tanks were fueled. Their ammo was live and real. Their maps were current. the intelligence on the enemy, meaning in the West, was always updated. And only some lucky fate allowed the West this victory over the East. Believe me, all of us in the Western world grew up with a healthy dislike of the Marxist Gulag system, nowhere near as much as we have been inculcated and indoctrinated with Hitler's evil, cruel system. But there was enough anti-communism left in most of us, instinctive, visceral gut reaction to this evil empire, as President Reagan called it, that there was healthy skepticism and we believed virtually anything about the Soviets. But would we believe what I'm about to read you about France or about England, much less about America? Listen. Gruesome Harvest, page 21. France, according to the International Red Cross, had 680,000 former German soldiers slaving for her in August 1946. 475,000 of their number had been captured by the United States and later turned over to the French for forced labor. French treatment of her slave subjects is revolting to the civilized conscience. In an article entitled, quote, "We should not resemble them," Figaro reveals the following. Figaro is a famous French paper. In certain camps for German prisoners of war, living skeletons may be seen, almost like those in German concentration camps, and deaths from undernourishment are numerous. We learn that prisoners have been savagely and systematically beaten, and that some have been employed in removing mines without protection equipment, so that they have been condemned to die sooner or later. People, of course, will point to the Gestapo tortures, the gas chambers, and the mountains of human bodies found in the internment camps in Germany. But these horrors should not become the theme of sports competition in which we endeavor to outdo the Nazis. We have to judge the enemy, but we have a duty not to resemble him. Let me just interject here. One thing that Le Figaro does not point out, that the pictures and scenes of horrors encountered by the Allies when they moved into the German area, into these German camps, was because Germany was utterly devastated by a genocidal bombing campaign, especially by America and the British. So blame the victim. Nothing moved to those camps. No food, no medicine. The water mains were broken. So it's totally different, the conditions that the Americans and British and French found in German camps at the end of a hotly contested shooting war than here in August 1946, when the shooting had stopped in Europe already for a year and a half. So to make the comparison is false, disgusting, and I object to it over and over again, to compare apples and oranges. The treatment that I am reporting to you, strictly quoting from Allied sources of German prisoners of war, took place in peacetime, not in wartime. There's a big difference. As to the blood libel of the German gas chambers, we have disposed of those a long time ago as Allied Jewish propaganda. Now gets back to Gruesome Harvest. Gathering his facts from numerous reliable sources, Louis Clare writes in The Progressive of the horrible conditions in the French camps of German prisoners of war. He says, in a camp in the Sarthe district for 20,000 prisoners, inmates receive 900 calories a day. Thus 12 die every day in the hospital. 4,000 to 5,000 are unable to work at all anymore. Recently, trains with new prisoners arrived in the camp. Several prisoners had died during the trip. Several others had tried to stay alive by eating coal that had been lying in the freight train by which they came. In the Orleans camp, the commander received 16 francs a day per head or prisoner to buy food, but he spent only 9 francs, so that the prisoners were starving. In the Charentes district, 2,500 of the 12,000 camp inmates are sick. A young French soldier writes to a friend just returned from a Nazi camp, "I watch those who have made you suffer so much, dying of hunger, sleeping on cold cement floors, in no way protected from rain or the wind. I see kids of 19 who beg me to give them certificates that they are healthy enough to join the French Foreign Legion. Yes, I who hated them so much today can only feel pity for them. A witness reports on the camp in Langres. I have seen them beaten with rifle butts and kicked with feet in the streets of the town because they broke down of overwork. 2 or 3 of them die of exhaustion every week. In another camp near Langres, 700 prisoners slowly die of hunger. They have hardly any blankets and not enough straw to sleep on. There is a typhoid epidemic in the camp which has already spread to the neighboring village. In another camp, prisoners receive only 1 meal a day but are expected to continue working. Elsewhere, so many have died recently that the cemetery space was exhausted and another cemetery had to be built. In a camp where prisoners work on the removal of mines, regular food supplies arrive only every second day, so that prisoners make themselves a soup of grass and some stolen vegetables. All prisoners of this camp have contracted tuberculosis. Here and elsewhere, treatment differs in no respect from the Nazi SS brutality. Many cases have been reported where men have been so horribly beaten that their limbs were broken. In one camp, men were awakened during the night, called out of their barracks, and then shot because of attempted escape. There are written affidavits proving that in certain camps, commanding officers sold on the black market all the supplies that had been provided by American Army authorities. There are other affidavits stating that prisoners were forced to take off their shoes and run the gauntlet, and so on and so on. These are the facts. Now, the author, Frank Keeling, gives you the sources in this book, Gruesome Harvest. Do yourself a favor. Go to your nearest American or Canadian public library. Ask for the book. Ask for the book. If they don't have it, ask them to stock it. Why should they suppress information? And if you cannot get it, then ask for it through interlibrary loan. Gruesome Harvest is the title. I continue on page 22. After we had delivered the first 320,000 prisoners, the French returned 2,474 of them to us, claiming that we had given them weaklings. Just like at a slave auction. America had given them weaklings, and they returned them. Correspondents described them as a beggar army of pale, thin men, clad in vermin-infested tatters. All were pronounced unfit for work, 3/4 of them on account of malnutrition, and 19% had to be hospitalized. Now, remember, this is a story the French are saying that you, Americans, delivered the first 320,000 prisoners to them. And these cruel French that we have just read about say to you, to the American authorities, that 19% of them that they got had to be hospitalized, and that all the others were unfit to work. So is James Buck not correct when he talks about the last dirty secret of the Second World War? Is that not the policy that Dwight Eisenhower invoked? We quoted it. You can research it yourself. And I'm purposely quoting you from American sources, basically from American sources, so that you cannot accuse me and whitewash and kind of salve your conscience and say, oh, this German is only quoting me Nazi propaganda. The Nazis by that time were in American captivity, tortured, beaten, starved, executed, murdered. No Nazi propaganda here. American newspaper reports, American military government people who had a conscience, bearing their souls, French people with decency, exposing what went on. So Associated Press photographer Henry Griffin, who had taken pictures of the corpses piled in all German concentration camps, including Buchenwald and Dachau, said of the men, quote, "The only difference I can see between these men and those corpses is that here they are still breathing." Asked to investigate, the Red Cross reported the prisoners were receiving inhuman treatment. Upon our threat to stop further transfers, the French protested that they must have more prisoners or suffer heavy financial loss. In other words, the French wanted more slaves, white slaves, German slaves, or they would suffer heavy financial loss. That all of them were unfit to work, that 19% had to be hospitalized, made no difference. Even weak slaves bring profit. It then came out that the French government was hiring the men out to French employers, for which it collected regular union wages, an average of 150 francs per day per man. Out of this, the government paid each prisoner 10 francs and stood their daily cost of upkeep of perhaps another 40 francs, leaving a daily net profit of 100 francs per slave. In the aggregate, the French government stood to make a profit of more than 50 billion francs a year from its German slaves. No wonder it became upset when we threatened to stop handing them more Germans over. When we resumed deliveries, we took pains to make sure that the prisoners were in satisfactory physical condition. In other words, the Americans first fed their German slaves so that they wouldn't be all unfit to work, so the French could be assured to make a profit. Disgusting. Let me get back to this gruesome harvest book. When we resumed deliveries, we took pains to make sure that the prisoners were in satisfactory physical condition. The men would be lined up and examined, their mouths opened and inspected, their chests thumped, their joints tried, their eyes, ear, and teeth looked over, as if they were horses being offered for sale. No, not as if they were horses offered for sale. As if they were black slaves down in the deep south, because I have read books about that, how America sold its black slaves. That's the way it was done at slave auctions. Except this here is totally illegal, totally immoral, totally against the Geneva Conventions, which the Allied nations bragged that they were adhering to, and have excoriated the Germans that they did not. You see, I believe that this constant propaganda barrage against the Germans is simply a forward defense so that the Germans do not get out of their foxholes and do what I am doing right now with these programs, namely defend themselves. So this constant avalanche of hatred by Jewish writers and the American media against Germans is nothing more than to cover their own ass. And they fear exposure, and they're going to get exposed. I guarantee you to it. So, let's see again how America treated its German prisoners before they turned it over to the slave masters of France. When we resumed deliveries, we took pains to make sure that the prisoners were in satisfactory physical condition. The men would be lined up and examined, their mouths opened and inspected, their chests thumped, their joints tried, their eyes, ear, and teeth looked over, as if they were horses being offered for sale. GIs witnessing the spectacle were overheard to remark, "Gee, I hope we don't ever lose a war." And he has a footnote here. On December the 5th, 1946, it was announced that the American government had requested the repatriation by October 1st, 1947. Now remember, that's more than 2 years, 2.5 years after the war ended. They were still slaving away. America was still dealing in German slaves. And so, America wanted these prisoners that they had given to the French, traded to the French, fed, that they were strong enough to do slave labor for the French. And so on December the 5th, 1946, it was announced that the American government had requested the repatriation by October 1st, 1947, of the 674,000 German POWs it had turned over to France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. All these European nations, all those hypocritical little Mickey Mouse countries that have been attacking the Germans mercilessly. And right during this time, when we are talking about here 1946-47, the Allied hypocrites, the Allied judges, the Allied military personnel were nailing the German administration of Adolf Hitler left, right, front and center, all the smallest little bureaucrat with being an administration of criminals because they held prisoners. They had what they called slave laborers. Well, let me tell you, I have met many of these so-called German slave laborers since. They fared one hell of a lot better than the Germans did in American or French or Russian hands. Now that's just simply a fact. And no amount of moralizing by the American media and Jewish scribblers can undo a fact. So let's see what this American writer, Ralph Keeling, in his book Gruesome Harvest had to say. So the Americans turned over prisoners not only to France, but also to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. France had agreed to release its 620,000 of this number, but gave no definite pledge of when they would be freed. The French government also disclosed that the United States, in the December 21st, 1945 memorandum, expressly stipulated that the Germans captured by the American army and handed over to France were chattels to be used indefinitely for forced labor as part of France's war reparations from Germany. Meanwhile, reports continued to pour into the press that conditions in the French slave camps remained as bad or worse than before. Starvation diets, little protection from the elements or disease in filthy, vermin-infested quarters. Now you see, the reason why it rankles with people like me and Germans that have a little backbone left and are not totally brainwashed by Allied re-education is because we all share a snail house of experience. I lived in the French area of occupation after the Second World War. I know of the terror as a little boy when the French army soldiers, many of them Algerians, Moroccan colonial troops, came to look for my mother and my sisters and robbed us blind, took our last food from the basement, our last potatoes, the little sugar we had saved up from the wartime rations. I know all that. And that's why nobody can tell me that it was a little different. And no amount of moralizing by Jewish or American scribblers is going to change it. I am also a survivor. Now you can go and keep listening to all the prattling of those Jewish Hollywood survivors in Steven Spielberg's rigged documentation. Go and listen to it. You do yourself a disservice. Because if you only forever keep listening to those people and not also hear our side of the story, you do yourself a disservice. We cannot force you to listen. We cannot force you to be fair. Not for us. The Germans suffered their way through this Golgotha. The German graveyards are full of German men and women that paid the price. Nothing that you will ever say or do will resurrect them. We have been vilified for the last 50 years. But you do yourself a disservice, your children and your grandchildren, if you teach them garbage history. Because believe me, garbage information will produce garbage decisions, and you will compound America's problems by a lack of honesty. I'm Ernst Zundel with another Voice of Freedom program. When we return with another one, we will talk about the British treatment of slaves turned over to the British by America, German slaves. I'm Ernst Zundel.
Lie, 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 lie.